Thanks for tuning in. Dr. Jeffrey Kotyk has joined me today to talk about his thesis work, which largely deals with Buddhism and astrology in China and early medieval China. Thanks, Jeffrey, for joining. It's a pleasure having you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we have done a discussion before a year or so, probably exactly before a year or something like that, talking about astrological determinism in Indian Buddhism. So in this case, which is probably part of what you address in your thesis, but your doctoral thesis is far more larger than what we previously spoke about, and this is just what we're going to do today is just scratching the surface, or probably not even scratching the surface. So before jumping into any of those, I think it'll be great to kind of talk about your own self and your background, your academic background, and how you made your way into study of Buddhism, Chinese, Japanese astrology, and so on.
Sure. Well, I did my PhD at Leiden University in the Netherlands, and my dissertation was titled Buddhist Astrology and Astral Magic in the Tang Dynasty. But before that, I did my master's degree in Japan at Komazawa University, where I primarily researched the history of Chinese Buddhism. And I'm originally Canadian, and I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Alberta, and I basically studied Chinese and Japanese as my main areas of study for those years. And also between my master's degree and my PhD, I also spent a few years living in India and Nepal. And I was ordained as a Buddhist monk for 2 years in India. And so I had a very strong interest in Buddhism. And sometime, I guess it would have been around the year 2013, 2014, I started looking at some of these Chinese Buddhist texts that refer to zodiac signs. And I thought, well, that's rather interesting. I didn't know that zodiac signs were part of Buddhism. And then I looked at the history of the zodiac signs and I saw that they originated in Mesopotamia. And I thought, well, how did the zodiac signs end up in Buddhist sutras? So that got the ball rolling. And before long, I realized that there was all this astrological literature in medieval Japanese and Chinese sources, which had never really been studied and documented. And a large part of these texts were either part of Buddhist traditions and in some cases even part of the Buddhist canon. So I decided to do that as a PhD project. And then from there, I also started looking at later developments of astrology in China, going to the 16th century. And I saw that there was also Islamicate astrology transmitted to China in the 14th century. And then later, even in the early 17th century, the Jesuit Catholic missionaries also translated some astrological texts into Chinese. So I realized that there's a lifetime of work to do on these materials, and it's an ongoing project. And right now I'm continuing to research this, and I hope to publish a book on the history of astrology in East Asia, hopefully within the next 2 years.
That's great. So will it be a commercial book or it is an academic book?
Oh, it'll definitely be an academic book, but hopefully we can keep the price reasonable, or maybe we can even make it open access so everybody can download the PDF for free.
Okay, cool. So your distinct advantage comes from learning the languages of Chinese and Japanese, which gives you a direct gateway to have access to Chinese or Japanese manuscripts.
Yeah. So studying classical Chinese is necessary in order to access these texts. Even the Japanese texts require literacy in classical Chinese, because in medieval Japan, most of the monastic authors wrote in classical Chinese as the sort of lingua franca. I also studied a bit of Sanskrit. I don't claim to be competent in Sanskrit, but I have a basic knowledge of Sanskrit, and I know how to use the dictionary and the grammar tables. So I've also looked at some of the Sanskrit materials as well.
So, okay. Let's move into Tang Dynasty. So when was this actually prevalent, the Tang Dynasty in China?
So the Tang Dynasty starts in around the year 618, and then
Okay.
it ends in the first years of the 10th century. So it's collapsing around the year 900 to about 908. So
Okay.
it lasted for about 300 years. And the Tang Dynasty is notable in Chinese history because it was very cosmopolitan. You had people from all over the world traveling to China at the time to live there, do business, study. There were a lot of diplomatic relations. So this is the time when China's interacting with Persia, with India, with Southeast Asia, and a lot of the global trade connections are really starting to increase in this time period. Also because maritime technology had improved considerably, so a lot of ships were starting to travel all the way to the South Chinese coast from India and the Near East. And the overland trade routes, the caravans also came over all the way from India, Central Asia, and as far away it seems as Syria as well. There were also
Oh,
Syrians visiting China at the time. And we know that because there was Nestorian Christians. The East Syriac Christian Church also had a presence in Tang Dynasty China.
okay. So I think you mentioned that Tang Dynasty is quite diverse in terms of accepting people from across the world,
Mm-hmm.
and they didn't shy away from gaining knowledge from people outside the Chinese territory. So astrology was, what was the role of astrology in Tang Dynasty, or did it have a reasonably uh, good recognition, such as India, or probably in during the first 1500 years, most of the kings or the kingdoms had good recognition to astrology, and some of the kings in India had actually practiced astrology, and they were expert astrologers. So, what was the case in Tang Dynasty, and how was it perceived, and how was astrology accepted as a phenomenon?
Well, we have to make a distinction between Chinese astrology, like native Chinese astrology, and the
Okay.
astrology which came from foreign countries. So China has its own system of celestial omenology,
Hmm.
and that is not horoscopy. So they didn't produce birth charts showing the positions of the planets at a certain time and date, but rather the Chinese court, and only the Chinese court, observed phenomena in the sky, and they would interpret these various celestial phenomena as either being beneficial or unbeneficial to the Chinese people and the court and the country as a whole. So this didn't involve individuals. And this sort of knowledge was used in military applications, political applications, but it wasn't used to divine the fortunes of people. So celestial omenology, native Chinese astrology existed at the court alongside the introduction of foreign forms of astrology. And so starting in the 4th century in China, so this is before the Tang Dynasty, the Shardulakarnavadana, a Buddhist text, is translated. And then this text includes a lot of information about the nakshatras.
Okay.
So the 28 lunar mansions from India. And I should clarify that the Chinese also have a system of lunar stations, and it's also 28 in number. And for the longest time, some scholars have suggested that the lunar stations originated in Babylonia or China or India, and then they were transmitted to other countries. But as it turns out, the lunar stations in China developed independently of India, and the Indian nakshatras, the lunar mansions, also developed independently of foreign influences. And we know that also because the nakshatras appear in the Atharva Veda, and the system of lunar stations, mansions, is not present in the Babylonian sources. The Babylonians very well understood the period of revolution of the moon, but
Hmm.
they didn't have lunar stations. So the Shardulakarnavadana was translated first in the 4th century, and it provides basic information on the nakshatras, and it also gives various associations with different gods and so forth. So Kotyk is associated with Agni. But this level of astrology was very basic, and it also wasn't practical in a Chinese context because the lunar mansions in the Indian context at the time were measured in muhurta. So that's the day is divided into 30 muhurta. But the Chinese have a very different system of timekeeping, and their lunar stations were measured with degrees. And the Chinese divide the ecliptic and celestial equator into 365.25 degrees, which is different from the parameter that we use today, which is 360 degrees. The Shardulakarnavadana doesn't mention 360 degrees. The early Indian sources that I've looked at always measure the nakshatras using the muhurtas. And then in later centuries, we have texts like the Mahasamnipata, which is a collection of Buddhist Mahayana sutras. And this text includes some sections which also mention the zodiac signs and the planets, etc. But this isn't necessarily astrology, it's just incorporating the symbolism of these astrological concepts into a Buddhist sutra. The really first substantial introduction of Indian astrology into Chinese seems to date around the 6th century Common Era. And that's when it appears a text such as the Gargiya Jyotish was translated into Chinese among a number of other texts. Unfortunately, we don't have this text anymore. It seems that they made a few copies of it and they didn't survive until modern days. But nevertheless, we know that there was Chinese interest at the court level in Indian astrology fairly early on. And then the first substantial introduction of the 7-day week. So the 7-day week, you know, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, etc. This concept, which originates in Ptolemaic Egypt. So we have the planetary rulers over the hours and the days. This concept seems to have been first even mentioned in Chinese sometime around the mid 7th century. And that's because the Christians sent their first emissary to the Chinese court in the 7th century. And one of the Nestorian Christian texts in Chinese mentions the hour that Jesus was crucified. And so this is an indirect reference to Hora hours, although the Chinese just simply says time using the character, the shi, which just means time. But in any case, that's the first reference to the Hora. And if you look at the New Testament, the Greek, it says hora specifically, but that's not necessarily so significant. It didn't mean that the Chinese incorporated this into their timekeeping system. It's really only in the following century, in the 8th century, that we see the first introduction of the 7-day week, as well as other forms of Indian astrology being seriously studied. And it starts with the Buddhists. So in the 720s, there was an Indian monk named Shubhakara Simha, and he was from Nalanda University, Nalanda Monastery. He was a very learned monk, and he was translating a very significant tantric Buddhist text called the Vairocana Abhisambodhi. And this was a difficult text to understand for the Chinese, so his companion and colleague, the monk Yixing, helped him to produce a commentary on this text. And there's a significant portion of that commentary which gives an overview of astrological concepts that would have been understood by Shubhakara Simha. And this commentary describes things such as the 7-day week, the lunar mansions, this, also the titis, so that's the lunar days of Indian astrology, the Paksha system. So there's the Krishna Paksha and the Shukla Paksha, so that's the waxing and waning periods of the moon. But the problem is that the commentary simply says, as it is described in the Indian calendar, which is basically saying, please see the Indian calendar if you have any questions. But if you're a Chinese monk who doesn't read Sanskrit and doesn't have access to an Indian professional, you're at a loss. They didn't produce an authoritative astrological manual at the time. Yixing died suddenly in 727, and Shubhakara Simha passed away several years later. But in the following generation, there was a monk named Amoghavajra, and Amoghavajra was charged with the task of creating an authoritative manual of Indian astrology in Chinese. And so starting in the 750s, he started compiling an astrological manual in Chinese. And this was the first text to give an overview of the lunar stations, the nakshatras, also the 7-day week, and also a number of other Indian astrological concepts. But it doesn't go into horoscopy. So it does mention that the planetary configurations can have a very significant impact on a person. So referring to transits, basically. But it doesn't provide enough information, for example, to go into any detail about this. And again, it says, please see the Indian calendar, please see the Indian astronomers. So at the time, at the Chinese court, there were a number of Indian astronomers. The most famous one was Gautama Siddhartha.
Gautama Siddhartha. Okay.
That's the same name as Shakyamuni Buddha, but it's not Shakyamuni Buddha. He was just there was an Indian there was an Indian family, the Gautamas, and there was also the Kashyapas, and there was also the monk Kumara. And so there were various Indian astronomers working for the Chinese court at the time. But that isn't very convenient, again, for the average Chinese monk who needs to determine the astrological election to perform a ritual, because he doesn't have access to the professional astronomers at the Chinese court.
Sure.
That would be like saying, like, you need to consult the National Observatory of your country. Well, it's not very convenient for most people. You can't just go there, knock on their door, and ask for some advice. If you're the emperor, or you're the emperor's chief monk, well, that's fine. You can go and talk to the head astronomer, but it doesn't work for the average monk. And my theory is that this prompted a lot of widespread popular interest in astrology. And within a few decades, we have horoscopy actually translated into Chinese. And it seems that horoscopy was coming from Indo-Iranian sources. So that is to say, people coming from what we would call Western India, so the Gujarat, Punjab, Hindu Kush regions. So they were probably a mix of Iranian and Indian peoples, and there were also Sogdians as well. And so Sogdians were a Central Asian people who had a great deal of Persian and Indian influences in their culture.
Okay.
And
I just wanted to clarify a thing or two before we move on with Indo-Persian culture into China. Like earlier you mentioned about Chinese omenology before any kind of horoscopy being practiced in China, and its indigenous methods. So does this Chinese omenology has some kind of an influence from Babylonian omenology, which kind of because probably we might not have had any kind of text at that particular point of time from Babylonian tradition, but maybe I was just wondering if there are things that people recognize in terms of omens, which was probably practiced in Babylonian tradition as well, because some of the research works that are connected to the Babylonian omens and Babylonian tradition mention some interesting omens. So, like especially in terms of this dragon, like the eclipse kind of thing. So this was kind of common, and it was practiced, and the eclipse was recognized as a good thing or a bad thing, whatever it may be, across all the traditions, and they had their own ways of interpreting an eclipse, whether it is good for a king or bad for a king, or good for the people or bad for the people. So, do you know, like, if there is any kind of commonality in Chinese omenology that kind of connects other traditions across the world, not just Babylonian tradition?
well, there's definitely a lot of common themes between Chinese omenology and Babylonian omenology, and even Indian omenology. But the Chinese tradition developed completely independent of Babylonia. There's been people who have speculated that there might have been a connection, but to demonstrate that connection would be very difficult, because the Chinese omenology texts go back into the BCE period, and you'd have to be able to explain how cuneiform texts somehow made it to China when there were very few trade connections or even linguistic connections between China and so in like the year 500 BCE, there were no substantial diplomatic connections between even the Indian kingdoms and China. There was the
Sure.
Himalayas. There's the
Yeah.
Himalayas
I
separating them.
mean, not possible.
It's just not possible. Uh, so I mean, because Buddhism was only being translated into Chinese around the first century Common Era, so it would be very difficult to explain that connection. And I'm not convinced that there was any connection.
Okay.
It's also that historically, a lot of scholars have attempted to create links between different cultures and civilizations to explain phenomena, whereas it's easier just to suggest that they developed independent of one another.
Hmm.
So it's like, especially with the lunar stations, nakshatras are indigenous to India, but the Chinese also have their own system of lunar stations, which are 28 in number, but again, they developed independent of one another.
Sure. Okay. And there was one more thing that I wanted to talk is like perception of astrology in China. Uh, Most of the ancient astrological traditions consider astrology as a divination, not an actual. Even though there were a lot of scientific correlations that some of the ancient astrologers tried to attribute astrology with, astrology was largely considered as a divination. And even during the early Chinese astrology days, that is before the advent of horoscopy in China, astrology was largely a divinatory art which was practiced by China. And I'm not sure, I think you gave a specific term in the book, uh, but I just forgot that particular terminology, like what they call divination and what they call as horoscopy. So, is this the right way to think about? Is this the correct way to
Well,
judge what?
the Chinese word for divination is also applied to astrology as well. Jan
Okay,
to the verb Jan means to divine something, and it can refer to divining things with yarrow stalks, that is the I Ching, or to divine things through the stars. And there's also other ways you can divine things. You can divine things through the clouds and through natural phenomena like earthquakes and so forth. So the Chinese understood astrology as a form of divination for sure.
Sure. Okay. So, I just wanted to touch upon that because in the early Hellenistic tradition, Ptolemy was one of those astrologers who always tried to give a scientific quote to astrology. And
Hmm.
later, Abu Mashar, through his great introduction, um, uh, I mean, both were largely influenced by the work of Aristotle. So there is a lot of Aristotelian flavor that kind of, that kind of was existing at some point of time during the Hellenistic era and also during the Persian era. So I just wanted to know if there is some kind of connection with the Chinese people as well, but that probably was not possible before the 7th or 8th century, which you meant as the first kind of entry of horoscopic astrology into China, which probably was Dorotheus' work, right?
Yeah, it seems that there were a few lineages of horoscopy that were introduced into China. There's one text, it's a Buddhist text, which I don't think has any Dorothean elements, but it has things like the
Uh,
12 houses as well as transits. And this one Buddhist text also includes the mantras and some magic for warding off the evil effects of the planets. So it includes also magical elements as well. And it also incorporates some of the earlier Indian elements that had been translated by Amoghavajra. And at the same time, the court sponsored a translation of Dorotheus, or a material based on Dorotheus of Sidon. And we know that it's his material. It was Bill Mack, the scholar Bill Mack, who first determined this. So we have to give him credit for discovering this. This was several years ago.
and
He
this was
published it.
also in Tang Dynasty, right?
Yeah. So this is happening around the year 800,
Okay.
around the year 800. That Dorotheus, or material based on Dorotheus, is translated into Chinese. So Bill Mack discovered that. And if you look at the various doctrines which are preserved in some Taoist and also just later general Chinese horoscopic texts, we can see things like triplicity rulers, the lots, and various other doctrines which we can connect to Dorotheus of Sidon's work. Now, the language from which this text was originally translated, and unfortunately, we don't have the original text. We just have
Uh,
fragments of it and citations of it, but it's quite substantial, the citations we have of it. Uh, we can assume that it was probably translated from Persian
okay.
because Al-Tabari's translation of Dorotheus actually occurred around the same time, interestingly enough, but I don't think the Chinese text was translated from Arabic. The Chinese fragments are still different in context from the Benjamin Dykes and David Pingree's translation of Dorotheus of Sidon from the Arabic, Al-Tabari's translation. The other issue is I'm not sure that there were any competent literate Arabic scholars in China at the time, but there were plenty of people who were bilingual and perfectly competent in Persian. And we also know that the Sasanian dynasty had translated Dorotheus of Sidon in the 3rd century, and they had also revised that translation again in the 4th or 5th century. And even the Arab historians also mentioned that the Persians had translated Ptolemy and Dorotheus and so forth. So this material based on Dorotheus of Sidon was translated into Chinese, and there was also a lot of other material translated into Chinese around the same time that doesn't seem to have any direct link to extent horoscopy. So for example, the lunar apogee, treated as a planet, much in the same way that Rahu and Ketu are treated as planets, was also introduced into Chinese horoscopy. And the lunar apogee, Yue Bei in Chinese, is a very malefic planet. And that was introduced. And there's also another planet called Zi, which literally translates as purple mist. And it moves along the ecliptic, and it tracks intercalary months. And this is not something that we see anywhere else in the world. And there's also other elements too of the horoscopy. So the 12th house, for example, represents appearances, the native's appearance and so forth. And that's anomalous in the history of astrology, because usually the 12th house represents misfortune and so forth. But in Chinese horoscopy, from this period, it represents something else.
Okay.
And horoscopy became very, very popular in China after it was introduced, and it was sponsored by the court as well. And it seems that actually an historian cleric might have been involved in this. So his name was Li Su, and he was working for the Bureau of Astronomy at the Chinese court at the time. So earlier generations, there were Indians, and then later there was Persians or ethnically Persian people working for the Chinese court as astronomers. And the text of Dorotheus was brought over by, I think it was Li Miqian. And his name actually might have been Michael. So Miqian, that name in Chinese, probably was originally Michael. So it seems that he might have been also a Christian. And that's not necessarily so surprising, because Nestorian Christians were also very active at the Abbasid court as well. So Christian astrologers were noteworthy persons also at the court of the Abbasid Caliphate. So the poets at the time in China took an interest in this, and we see references to horoscopic ideas and concepts also in the poetry of China at the time. And then the Tang Dynasty comes to an end in the first years of the 10th century. And within a few decades, several decades later, you have the Song Dynasty arise, which is another one of these great dynasties of Chinese history. And judging from the artwork and some of the mentions in court records and records of the sayings of the emperors and so forth, horoscopy was still very popular among the elites of the Song Dynasty. But at the cave of Dunhuang, which is in northwest China, sometime toward the end of the 10th century, somebody put all of this material, papers, books, paintings, scrolls, and so forth, into a cave, and then they walled it up with bricks. And then in the early 20th century, European explorers opened up this cave, and they found all these great texts. And there, in that cave was a horoscope. So we actually have a horoscope from, I believe it's the 10th century, late 10th century.
Wow.
And it gives the positions of the planets, and it speaks of the natives' fortunes, and it speaks of the annual perfections. And so we know that even in this remote location, there were active astrologers and there were clients who presumably were willing to pay for astrological consultations. So astrology was quite popular still, even in the 10th century. And then as we move along in the other centuries, Marco Polo visits China, and he mentions that in the capital you have astrologers of different persuasions and backgrounds. So there were Muslim astrologers, there were Chinese astrologers, and also in the 14th century, there was the translation in the early years of the Ming Dynasty of the Al-Mudkal, which is an introduction to astrology, and it's mostly a summary of Claudius Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's in the 14th century. And then in the 16th century, we have eminent scholars such as Wan Mingying producing great compendia, which is just like, it's hundreds and hundreds of pages of information about astrology, compiling all these astrological texts into kind of like into a great summary of astrology. And so he's operating around the same time, basically one generation before William Lilly in England on the other side of Eurasia. And so what I've tried to point out in my scholarship is that astrology was just as popular in China as it was in Europe.
Sure.
And then in the 17th century, we have translations by Jesuit missionaries
Okay.
of primarily Ptolemaic astrology, which was mainstream in Europe at the time. So they translated astrology, horoscopy, and also various European texts on mathematical astronomy into Chinese at the time. And then that's the basic history of horoscopy in China. So culturally, it was quite significant too, because we start seeing the planets in anthropomorphic forms in the art record starting in the 8th century. And so we have the Indian depictions of the Navagraha
Sure.
appear primarily through Buddhist mediums. And then later in the 9th century, we have depictions of the planets in anthropomorphic forms. So Venus is holding a lute, and Mars is a warrior, Mercury is a scribe. And this is different from the Navagraha depictions that we see in contemporary India.
Yeah,
But
I think you gave the images in the.
I do, yeah. So
Yeah.
you can look at my dissertation and you can look at the various images. So some of them were Indian, and then in following generations, they appear to come from Iranian sources. But I've been challenged by that by some art historians. They said, well, can you point to a Sasanian Iranian example of a planet? And you can't. And part of the reason for this, it appears, is that the Zoroastrians demonized the planets. They thought of all the planets as demons. So they didn't want to depict the planets in anthropomorphic forms. However, because it's Iranian does not necessarily mean that it is Sasanian. And my estimation, it appears that the icons in question came through Sogdian sources, and the Sogdians were Iranian people, but they weren't Persian. Sogdians were not Persian. They spoke a language which was similar to Persian, but they were still a separate people. And the same sort of icon, the iconographical motifs, appear in the medieval Arabic and Persian manuscripts. So Venus playing the lute or a guitar, Mercury the scribe, and so forth. Very similar motifs appear in the Middle East, and you can see this in the art record of Persian and Arab art. So in my estimation, there was this very significant input of Iranian and Indo-Iranian and Indian astrology into Chinese culture. And then also this astrology was transmitted to Korea and also to Japan. The Japanese developed a tradition called Tsukuyodo, and it was primarily monks who practiced this. So they were professional astrologer monks, and they cast horoscopes. So Murasaki Shikibu in the Tale of Genji mentions these monks.
And all this is in after the Tang Dynasty, which is post Tang Dynasty, right?
Yeah, it's post Tang Dynasty. So a lot of the astrological techniques and texts were preserved in Japan, actually.
Okay.
And so Tsukuyodo, this group of professional astrologer monks were very prominent in medieval Japan, but they disappear around the 14th century, the late 14th century.
I thought you also mentioned like monks were not actually allowed to practice astrology, and they were forbidden.
That's interesting, because the monastic rules say that as a monk, you're not supposed to divine fortunes for people, because as a bhikshu, Bhikshu literally means beggar. You're supposed to
Yeah,
rely
sure.
on people's offerings.
Yeah.
But historically in China and Japan, most of the monastic rules, the Vinaya, was ignored. So even though the text says you're not supposed to practice astrology, I think you could either just ignore that, or you could interpret it as don't practice it for a profit. So don't try to get rich off of astrology.
Okay.
But in reality, most of the monastic rules were just routinely ignored because there's hundreds and hundreds of monastic rules, and some of them are very impractical, and nobody expected everyone to follow them.
Okay. So I wanted to kind of touch upon the language of transmission, or from which language the texts were transmitted from.
Hmm.
Persia, from India. Obviously, it has to be Sanskrit and no other option. But
Well,
when
well, well, Sanskrit, but also the Prakrits as well. There were also Prakrit
okay,
texts.
sure. So, however, when it comes to transmission of texts from the regions surrounding Iran and Iraq, it has to be Arabic or it has to be Persian. Uh, I think 2 months ago, I had a conversation with Martin Ganston about his book, The Jewel of Annual Astrology,
Hmm.
where I had asked him about which language was the source text written in, and
Hmm.
from which language was it later translated to Sanskrit or other Indian languages. So I kind of put out my own speculation. It's like saying that it probably had to be Persian because, and we're talking about 16th or 17th century or 15th, 16th, and 17th century. So which was probably when some of the astrological texts were transmitted from Persia or Iran and Iraq into India through the Mughal rulers, obviously. So we don't know how it was done in the 13th century, but it was written and translated in 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. And
Hmm.
the one thing is, like, Islamic religious texts were always in Arabic. I'm not sure. It may have been in Persian as well, but Islamic religious texts kind of predominantly were always written in Arabic. But uh, the actual official language of communication and exchange of scientific and other philosophical ideologies were basically done in Parsi, which is Persian. So, and considering the fact that astrology or astrological texts were transmitted during the late 7th or early 8th century from the Sasanian region into China, uh, probably might have been Persian, you know, over Arabic. I'm not sure because,
Well, the
yeah.
yeah, the material of based on Dorotheus of Sidon's work that was translated into Chinese, it's actually so elegantly translated into Chinese, and it doesn't have loan words in it from other languages, so there's no transcriptions of foreign loan words into Chinese. So they did a very good job of translating it into technical Chinese. Uh, by the process of elimination, it was probably Middle Persian
Okay.
that was the source language, although it's also possible because David Pingree had speculated that Dorotheus might have also been translated into Syriac. And the Syriac language, even today, there's a lot of manuscripts which discuss astrology, and there's a few people who are even looking at the Syriac translation of Claudius Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, if I
Oh,
remember correctly. So actually the Syriac language, ancient Syriac language, had a lot of astrological literature in it. So it's quite possible too that it might have been translated from Syriac into Chinese. But I would prefer to suggest a Middle Persian source, simply because there was actually a lot of Persian diaspora who had settled in China, because after the year 650, the Sasanian dynasty is destroyed, but a lot of the nobility from that dynasty had settled in China. So there was the Prince Peruz, who had fled from the invading armies, and he eventually went to China, but a lot of the nobility from China also settled in China. And for subsequent centuries, there was basically a diaspora of Christians and Zoroastrians, and they were identified as Persian up until like at least the 9th century.
So what this kind of indirectly implies is that some of the texts that we think have been lost in Islamization of society in Iran might actually be present in some form, either somewhere in Japan or China, or somewhere that we
Well,
don't know.
the texts that we have were translated, and my sense is that if you look at the citations of these Tang Dynasty translations of astrological literature, even going to like the 16th century, because we have these compendia of astrological materials, and it's citing a lot of materials which had been translated in earlier centuries. And my sense is that this is actually a window, in an indirect window into Iranian forms of astrology,
That's
earlier
great.
Iranian forms of astrology, simply because the Chinese translated it and preserved the translations and the techniques and so forth. But then I guess the other issue is that the Chinese also developed horoscopy in their own way, because it became a common practice, and astrologers innovative, and they also develop things on their own terms. So it's a very difficult process of sifting through what was the original translation and what is a later development. In some cases, it's quite obvious. So if the astrologer is talking about the Chinese 5 elements, then clearly that's a local development. But then there's also large citations of material that go back to the Tang Dynasty translations of astrological texts from presumably Iranian sources.
Okay, that's cool. So one more thing that I wanted to talk about is like the text of Shardulakarnavadana. So when is it dated, and do we still have other translations floating around?
Actually, that's a very interesting text. So the text also gives definitions for different measurements. So it talks about the yojana,
Hmm.
and that's like, I guess, loosely translated as mile, but it gives the Magadha yojana. So the Magadha was a kingdom in northern India, which is now
India.
more or less corresponds to Bihar. And so by virtue of that, I would assume that the text originated in Magadha, because it's not giving you the Kashmiri yojana, it's giving you the Magadha
Magadha.
yojana. And judging from the fact that the early recensions of the Shardulakarnavadana don't mention the planets, it doesn't mention the zodiac signs, it just gives the nakshatras. It probably dates to around the 2nd or 3rd century Common Era.
Okay.
It's not part of the Pali Canon, so it's not part of the very earliest forms of the Buddhist canon. And it's also what happened with the Shardulakarnavadana is that there's the original story, and then there's the sort of divination manual that's appended to it. So the original story is that the Buddha's disciple Ananda is seduced by the Matanga girl who uses mantra.
Hmm.
She wants to marry him, so she uses this power of mantra to seduce him, and then he calls out for the
This,
Buddha,
which is
and
called
then
as the Matanga Sutra.
yeah, the other title for the text is the Matanga or Matangi Sutra.
Okay.
So, and then there's this story of how she is taught by the Buddha about the transgression she's committed, and then she becomes a bhikshuni, she becomes a nun. And then that's the end of the story. But what happened was that somebody appended this divination manual where you have the original story, and then the story continues in this extended version, and then they say, oh, well, in a past life, so-and-so was King Trishanku, and then he taught this Brahmin all of this information about astrology and measurements and so forth. And the original function of the Shardulakarnavadana in its extended form with all the astrology and measurements and all this other sort of technical information was to demonstrate that even like a Shudra, like or a Dalit, like an outcast person, a low caste person, can also possess all
Sure.
of this great knowledge about the stars and divination and so forth.
This is something that you deal with in this area where it covers about Brahmanism and all those things, astrology and Brahmanism.
Mm-hmm.
So, but obviously, if you look at the Upanishads, there is no limitation for any person born on earth to do anything. So anyone can be a Brahmin, and Brahmin is just the you know It is just a word given to a person who has consumed a lot of knowledge and knows a lot of things and scriptures. So, and I think we also had a discussion about this previous time in terms of how Brahmins were not really respected, and they were not allowed to practice astrology, or only they were allowed to practice astrology to some that kind of a thing during that time. And there were some rules which were laid out in Manusmriti, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, it's the Manusmriti, where it says that Brahmins who divine by the stars are not supposed to attend the sacrifice.
Yeah, yeah.
But then that changed over time. So once astronomy was endorsed by the courts of the Indian kings, then it became far more socially acceptable and even prestigious.
Yeah, sure. That's there. I think it pretty much covers everything, because you also touched upon astrology in Korea and Sukuyodo horoscope in Japan. So that's something that I wanted to kind of talk about. And we also spoke about early Buddhism and Sutra and Vinayas. So do you have anything specific to talk about the work as in?
So yeah, so in early Buddhism, you see references to essential Indian astronomical and calendrical concepts such as the titis, the
Yeah.
pakshas, and so forth. And also the nakshatras are evoked as deities in the Mahasamgika Vinaya. So the Mahasamgika Vinaya is technically a compilation of monastic rules, but it also has a lot of other features to it. And one of the features that I discovered was that it also evokes the nakshatras. So it seems that in ancient India, especially in the Magadha region, that they treated the nakshatras as divinities, as and later also they started treating the zodiac signs as divinities. They refer to them as devas, interestingly, in some of the Buddhist literature.
Okay.
Yeah, but in early Buddhist literature, you don't see references to the planets. So similar. So in the Pali Canon, if I recall correctly, there's no mention of the planets. But then that's also true of the Vedas. The Vedas don't speak of the Navagraha. The Navagraha appear in much later literature, such as the Shiva Dharma Shastra, which gives the evocations of the Navagraha, including Rahu and Ketu.
Um, I'm not sure if that is the actual uh, text or something like that, because the Rig Vedic texts and contributions by Dattatreya also talks about planets and their components. So maybe there is some work that needs to be done with regards to the mention of planets in Indian tradition, because it's largely an untouched area where most of the Indologists have kind of uh, they've stuck to the text that they already have, and they've not gone beyond that. So that's a gray area, and there is a lot of research that's need to be done. So I think that pretty much covers everything that I actually wanted to
Right.
touch. And as I already said, it's extremely difficult to cover up such an extensive work, which pretty much gives a prelude to Tang Dynasty, and also an afterword to Tang Dynasty. And you pretty much summed up
Summed
exactly
up the
how the
whole
book
history.
itself. Yes. So
Right. Well,
that's
hopefully I can continue doing this research, and we can also discuss the later centuries. I want to also look at the Jesuit Christian transmission of astrology in the early 17th century.
that's awesome.
So there's very long texts which are preserved. Interestingly, some of the texts are preserved in the Vatican Library.
Oh,
Yeah, and we can also compare the Chinese to the Latin, because the Chinese was translated from the Latin. So that's a
oh,
future project I have in mind. Ideally, in the long term, I can secure some sort of long-term funding for a very long-term project that would be dedicated just to the history of astrology on a global level in the ancient and medieval periods. Because we know that every culture in Eurasia and North Africa was practicing horoscopy once you reach the medieval period. And there's all of these common links in the techniques, the iconography, but we don't actually have like a comprehensive network of people talking to one another.
Sure.
And I think it's quite significant when you can point to medieval Japanese astrologers practicing a form of horoscopy, which is very, very similar to what they were doing in contemporary Portugal and Spain on the opposite side of Eurasia. And then if you were to walk the other way and pass through India and Persia and the Arab world, you would quickly find that, hey, these people were also practicing horoscopy in a very similar way. And theoretically, if you could translate for all these different cultures, you would realize that they were using the same techniques for the most part.
Sure.
So I think that's quite significant. So astrology is sort of like a global phenomenon, and it had all this common language. And despite being translated and developed in different languages and cultural contexts, the integrity of most of the techniques remained strong. So triplicity rulers is the same, whether you're in medieval Portugal or medieval Japan. It's the same concept, just in different languages. Whereas you don't see that sort of phenomena as much in, for example, the transmission of religion, right? So religions, religious traditions can change quite considerably over time when they're translated into different cultural and linguistic contexts. But interestingly, astrology, probably because it's such a technical practice, it remained very, very whole, and it wasn't transformed to any great extent. Especially in East Asia, a lot of the concepts were preserved. They added things on top of what they had received, but the original components all remained the same for the most part.
Okay. I mean, I think astrology was probably one of those things that connected two different regions that lied far apart from each other. So it's fascinating, and I hope your wishes in terms of achieving those funding comes true, so that you can continue doing what you're doing.
Right, and then
And
we can bring everybody together from around the world. I'd love to have like researchers of astrology from India and from Europe and Asia, and everybody come together, and we can have conferences and we can produce books. And so, I mean, there's decades of research that could be done on this topic. And I think in our world, which is increasingly globalized, cosmopolitan, internationalized, and everybody's talking to each other, that I think it would also just demonstrate that in the past, there were similar connections as well. And astrology was the medium through which this communication occurred.
Yeah, I think one of those fascinating things is that even without internet and all these modern day technology, people before 1500 years were really well connected. So, and
Yeah.
and that is very well reflected in the texts that we're reading today. So, yeah. So, okay. Thank you so much, and wishing you the very best for all your endeavors. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.